30th annual general meeting of the bank. This is a bank which started with a capital of $150 million some 30 years ago, has now grown into a 30 billion or a $6 billion dollar bank. And so today, all the major stakeholders have come together to take stock and re-strategize for the future. The theme for this year's event is implementing the vision and building a prosperous Africa for Africans. And so we've seen some 6 major agreements being signed, a $1 million railway project signed for Ghana. That particular project is supposed to unlock some $3.5 billion by way of assets in the transportation sector. We've seen the Afreximbank also provide or pledge some support for Malawi. They are going to be constructing some industrial and commercial parks in that particular country. That really is the agenda, how Africans are able to own their own development is the focus of the 30th annual general meeting of the Afreximbank. His Excellency, the President of the land, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, opened the conference. He has urged African countries to increase their funding of Exim Bank. He's even urged the private sector to also come on board to ensure that the bank has a bigger portfolio to support infrastructural development on the African continent. And so I'm here at the Accra Conference Center with the head of business, Edward Nyako, and my colleague, Esther Edu. Together we've been covering this particular event and following. So quickly, let me speak to Edward. Good afternoon to you once again. What are the highlights for you at this particular conference?
Well, what I would say is the highlight is the drive by Afreximbank under the leadership of Professor Benedict Urama to ensure that there's that synergy between Africa and the Caribbean, that is the diaspora who are found in the Caribbean, and leveraging on the strength of these two sides of on the side of the Atlantic to promote trade and business. Because what they have done at the moment, we've seen that CARICOM, that is the Caribbean community, they've signed an agreement and they're going to be part of the shareholders of Afreximbank, which is phenomenal because we're not just talking about an African continental free trade area. We see another region on the part of the world coming on board, which are also Africans, identifying with the drive. Because according to him, when COVID-19 broke out, it took Afreximbank and the Strive Masehiwa to bring these two regions together to ensure that Africa, that was more or less crowded out of the market because we do not have what it takes to be able to buy the vaccines, they came together and were able to procure these vaccines for Africa and the Caribbean. And so that is the essence of what this is about, facilitating trade between Africa and those in the diaspora. So for me, that is a great thing. And again, you talk about President Akufo-Addo talking about the private sector increasing its funding, because he made a statement that our financial institutions in Africa are undercapitalized. And that's how come when there's a turbulence on the market, we are hit hard. So there's a need for us to up our game in that regard. So when the private sector in Africa increase its shares in Afreximbank, in times of trouble, we can fall on our own and help us out of the challenges.
We saw the central bank governor here. President Akufo-Addo was urging central banks across the country, across the African continent, to ensure that the cost of borrowing is reduced for the private sector. Meanwhile, in our own backyard, we see, private sector financing very much expensive. What really do you think the strategy should be like?
Yes, that's a very important point in the sense that if you look at what is happening around the world now, if you look at central banks all over the world, because of the drive to tame inflation, cost of borrowing is very expensive. So it's a good call, but at the moment, the private sector is crowded out because government are borrowing more. Now, in our part of the world, we are doing it through the T-bills. The bond market is no more attractive as it used to be. So it's a good call, but for now, I don't think it's feasible for central banks in Africa or any part of the world to reduce interest rates.
I'll come back to you. We'll be talking about the common African currency. The AU Commissioner for Trade has been talking about the roadmap to having a common African country. So you gather your thoughts on those. Let me speak quickly to my colleague Esther Edu. She's on a business desk. Esther, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What have you been picking from the many talks that we've been listening to so far?
So according to the president of Afreximbank, President Benedict Orama, there will soon be a payment system between Africa and the Caribbeans, and that is going to ensure that Africa enhances trade with the Caribbeans. And also it came to light that movement in trade across the continent is very difficult. Yesterday I was here and Dangote was saying that for him to invest in another country, you will have to have free visa or visa on arrival. And that has deterred a lot of entrepreneurs from investing in other countries. Yes.
Right. But I mean, that has improved. We've seen a lot of African countries signing up to the visa on arrival policy.
Yes, the visa on arrival policy is not in a lot of countries. One instance he made was in Angola, where he said he wanted to invest in that country, but due to bureaucracies in acquiring a visa, he had to end up going to, I think, Zambia. And I think that deters a lot of entrepreneurs from investing in other countries. And for the Afreximbank, they also said that they have helped a lot of countries, especially during the COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war, and they injected a lot of monies into their economies to make sure they stabilize. And also, most economies have not really adjusted to the African continental free trade area, and they also injected monies into African economies. I think one country has not ratified, and the other countries that have ratified are part of the AU. They injected monies into their economies to make them more or less adjust to the African continental free trade area, which, according to them yesterday, they were saying that it is not really fully implemented to their satisfaction.
Certainly so. Certainly. I mean, we are still at the very introductory, stages of the African continental free trade area. A lot of countries are getting to understand the whole process. But Bishop Edward, quickly before we go, Esther was talking about the African continental free trade area, which has featured prominently at this particular conference. And one thing that will push this process is a common African currency. The AU chair for trade was talking about the convergence criteria. It looks like it's been very difficult, even in the ECOWAS sub-region.
It's a header that we all have to clear, but for now, I don't see it, maybe in the next decade or two, because talking about the convergence criteria, talking about the synergistic inflation and all those things, macroeconomic growth at certain level, it's very difficult. Like you said, in ECOWAS market, we've not been able to achieve this. So it's going to be very difficult to achieve that. But again, one key thing that I think under Afreximbank of Benedict Oroma's leadership that has been achieved is the PAPS, the Pan-African Settlement Payment System. For me, that is phenomenal, because if I buy a good or a goods in Kenya, through that platform, I need not to get dollars to buy those things.
So we may not even need a common currency with the PAPS.
Exactly. For now, we can still do business on this platform, because once you trade in cities, it can be converted into shillings in Kenya. So you buy Kenyan tea, then they can be converted, because there will be a clearinghouse, which they are planning that they should be established as part of the drive to make sure that it's done. But we are told that it takes about 120 seconds for this system to be done. Unlike those days where you are buying goods from Kenya, it will take about 2 or 3 days, almost a week, for you to be able to do that. And even then, you have to do that through dollars. So this is phenomenal, and I think kudos to the Afreximbank. And there's more that needs to be done, because talking about Afreximbank, they are saying that they're establishing industrial zones across the continent.
So we've seen Malawi receiving support for, I think, 2 different industrial zones.
Exactly.
With one particular company.
Yes, and then Gabon has established an industrial zone where we know Gabon is noted for timber product. Now, it's going to add value to the timber product in Gabon, so it will help in facilitating intra-African trade, which at the moment we are told is around 15% compared to the EU, which is over 50%. So these are the things we need to do to ensure that our economies will grow, because trade is the way to go. Other than that, we can make it and create jobs for the teeming youth, because if we are told that by 2030, 800 million of the population in Africa are going to be youth, then these youth, they are the human capital that is going to drive, and that's the market. So the continent of Africa, by 2050, we're going to have more people than any other part of the world. But the question is, what are we doing to be able to create jobs for them? So it calls for reflection that we need to make sure that these kind of meetings are meetings that are able to mobilize resources so that industries can be set up.
So far, 6 deals have been signed. The theme is to promote a prosperous Africa by Africans. Do you think this is
a journey of 1,000 miles started with, with one. So for me, it's great, and we need to push these ideas.
Right, let's begin to wrap up. Esther, quickly your final words. Then we come.
Well, I think that Africa is bound to grow if we really enhance trade on the continent. And one sure way of doing that is to leverage on the opportunities the African Continental Free Trade Area offers to all African countries.
Right. So it's day 2 of the 30th annual general meeting of the African Afreximbank here at the Accra International Conference Center. The whole process started yesterday night. It will be ending 2 days from now. And so GBC News, GBC Business, we are still here. We're bringing you the very latest as to what has been the key fallout from this particular conference. Over to you in the studio.
Thank you, Esther, Edward, and Morris. And as Morris rightly said, we will be bringing